It was one of those nights when everything just felt wrong, like I was drifting through my own life, unable to really connect with anything around me. I'd been married to Mark for nearly 10 years, but for the last few, I might as well have been a piece of furniture. Just there, doing my part. He was always buried in his work, on the phone, glued to his laptop, or locked in endless meetings. It didn't matter that we once shared everything. Our dreams, our laughter, our intimate moments. Because now, I was just the woman who made sure dinner was on the table and that the house was still standing when he got home. I can still picture that party like it was yesterday. It was one of those upscale events for Mark's business associates. Powerful people from the city who were more interested in flexing their status and counting their money than in making any real human connections. I didn't want to go. I was tired of being a background character in Mark's shiny, glamorous world. Tired of pretending to be the perfect wife, standing in the corner, smiling politely while he did all the important talking. But Mark insisted. "It'll be good for your image," he told me, as if I still cared about that. That's when I met Ethan. He was there to talk about potential investments, but from the second I shook his hand, I could tell there was something different about him. He had this confident energy, like he knew exactly who he was and what he wanted out of life. He was in his late 40s, ruggedly handsome in a way that didn't scream trying too hard, a rawness that drew me in. For the first time in a long while, I felt like someone was really seeing me, even though I had never felt more invisible in my marriage. He wasn't hitting on me, at least not obviously, but he wasn't like the others. There was something about him that made me feel important, like I wasn't just the wife of a successful man. We started talking business at first, of course, but I'd be lying if I didn't admit I was impressed by the way he moved through that room, talking to the most influential people, making everyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. By the end of the night, something clicked. Ethan wasn't just another businessman. He actually saw something in me, something Mark hadn't noticed in years. He made me feel like I wasn't just the woman who kept everything running in the background. The way he listened to me, the way he asked questions that mattered, the way his eyes lingered when he spoke to me, it was like I wasn't just a shadow. I felt noticed, maybe even valued. In the weeks that followed, Ethan began reaching out more. "We should grab lunch sometime," he said one day, casually mentioning some investment opportunities one might find interesting. At first, I thought it was just business, but then he started setting up lunches with other big names in the industry, introducing me to politicians and other high-profile figures. It wasn't just about business anymore. For the first time in years, I felt like I mattered, not just as Mark's wife, but as myself. A woman with her own ideas, her own worth. It was intoxicating. As time went on, I realized I was looking forward to my meetings with Ethan more than I probably should have. It wasn't just the business advice. It was the attention. Mark didn't look at me like that anymore. When Ethan spoke to me, it wasn't out of duty or obligation. He was genuinely interested in me. I found myself dressing differently for our meetings, paying more attention to how I looked, hoping he'd notice. I knew it wasn't right, but I couldn't stop. Things started to change slowly. Ethan invited me to more private events, intimate dinners where the talk went beyond business. We mingled with the city's elite, discussing art, politics, culture, things Mark had long stopped caring about. The more time I spent with Ethan, the more I realized he wasn't just helping me professionally. He was filling a void I didn't even know existed. It wasn't just business anymore. At first, I told myself it was. I convinced myself I was simply seizing opportunities he offered. Nothing more. But deep down, I knew it was about more than that. I was enjoying the attention. The way he made me feel like I was worth something more than just being a wife. And that was the problem. I started craving that feeling. When he looked at me, it wasn't with pity or duty. It was with real interest. The line between professional and personal began to blur. It didn't happen all at once. At first, we still talked business, mostly, but there were those little moments. The way his hand brushed against mine when we were sitting together at a dinner table. The way he smiled at me, just a beat longer than necessary. He started telling me about his life, about the people who mattered to him, the things he cared about. And I began to share too, things I hadn't shared with anyone in years. I never told Mark about any of these meetings. At first, I didn't see the need. I wasn't doing anything wrong, right? But as Ethan and I spent more time together, things shifted. I could feel myself getting drawn into something deeper, something I wasn't ready to face. I kept telling myself it was just business. That's all. But at night, when I lay next to Mark, I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. What would it be like to be with someone who actually saw me, who didn't just want me for what I could do for him, but who valued me for who I was? I didn't realize how far I'd fallen until the night Ethan invited me over after a business event. I should have seen it coming, but I didn't. And when I walked into his apartment that night, everything inside me shattered. I'd never felt more alive. It wasn't just the way he looked at me, or the way his touch lingered. It was like he was seeing me for the first time, and it felt like a drug I couldn't stop using. I don't know when it stopped being about business and started being about us. But once it did, I couldn't pretend anymore. What began as a few casual lunches and meetings became something I couldn't control. And once I crossed that line, there was no going back. With each meeting with Ethan, I found myself slipping further away from Mark. It stopped being about just wanting attention. It ran deeper than that. I was craving the validation I'd never gotten from my marriage. But more than that, Ethan was offering me something else entirely. Power. Real power. Something I'd never known before. I'd never been the one calling the shots. Never been the one whose decisions carried weight. But with Ethan, everything changed. He introduced me to people who could change my life. Business tycoons, government officials. People who saw me not as Mark Thompson's wife, but as someone worth noticing. Someone who mattered. Every time I saw him, every time he made me feel seen, I felt myself pulling away from the woman I had been with Mark and moving closer to someone new. Someone stronger, more independent, more alive. I didn't even know who this new version of myself was. But I didn't care. She felt like everything I had been missing. Ethan wasn't just offering business opportunities. He was giving me something far more dangerous. He gave me attention, the kind that made me feel seen in ways I hadn't in so long. Every glance, every smile, every touch. It was as though he knew exactly how to make me feel wanted, needed. I began to look forward to our meetings more than I should have. Every time we spoke, he made me feel like I was something special, like I had value outside of being Mark's wife. I wasn't just Mrs. Thompson anymore. I was Olivia, a woman with her own worth, her own desires. I kept telling myself it was just business, just networking, expanding my horizons. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. And yet, I couldn't stop. One night, after another charity event, Ethan invited me to his apartment. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I knew something was about to shift. Up until then, we'd kept things strictly professional. But there was this tension now, thick and palpable. We shared a few drinks, swapped stories about work and life, but the moment he leaned in, everything else just faded away. His lips on mine. It wasn't just a kiss. It was the breaking point. After that, everything changed. We spent the night together.
No hesitaste.
No second thoughts. Just pure, unrestrained need. The next morning, I woke up in his bed, tangled in the sheets. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel empty. The woman I had been, the wife who existed in the shadows of Mark's life, she was gone. In her place was someone new. Someone with desires, with needs, with a hunger I hadn't even known existed. I didn't know what to feel. I didn't feel guilty. Not really. For so long, I'd told myself it was Mark who was distant, who was too caught up in his own world to see me. I'd convinced myself that he had let me slip away, that I had tried everything. But in the end, I had to take care of myself. And now, with Ethan, I felt seen. I felt wanted. Mark, of course, had no clue. He was too wrapped up in his own world to notice the little changes in mine. I spent more and more time with Ethan, and when I was home, I wasn't really there. My mind was elsewhere. But Mark was too absorbed in his work to notice. He didn't care about the late nights, the empty house, the fact that I wasn't interested in hearing about his day. Why would he? He was busy. He was making deals, closing contracts, moving forward. That was all that mattered to him. I wasn't important anymore. But Mark, as consumed as he was, eventually started to notice that something wasn't right. I thought I'd been careful, but I guess not careful enough. One day, when he was reviewing some financial documents, something caught his eye. There were payments, large ones, linked to accounts connected to Ethan. At first, Mark probably thought it was a mistake, but he kept digging. The more he dug, the more he uncovered. Mark wasn't an idiot. It didn't take him long to realize something was off. I didn't know exactly when he figured it out, but it was obvious in the way he started acting. The way his gaze shifted when he looked at me, colder, more distant. When he began looking through my emails, I'm sure it wasn't because he suspected something at first. He probably didn't want to believe what he was seeing. But when he saw the emails between Ethan and me, the ones that started off strictly business but slowly evolved, he knew. The subtle flirtations, the personal touches in our messages. I didn't even notice how it had shifted until it was too late, until he'd read it all. The moment he discovered everything, I knew things would never be the same. He didn't confront me immediately. He didn't say a word. He just watched. I think he was hoping I'd stop, that I'd realize what I was doing and pull back. But I wasn't going to fix anything. I was done trying to keep everything together. I had finally found something that made me feel alive, and I wasn't about to let it go. Mark must have felt like his whole world was falling apart. For the first time in years, he saw what was happening right in front of him. His wife was leaving him, and it wasn't just for another man, it was for a life he couldn't give me. He couldn't offer me what Ethan had. Not anymore. I waited for the confrontation, the fight that was bound to come, but it never did. Not right away anyway. Mark didn't lash out. He didn't shout or accuse me. He just withdrew. There was no explosion, no angry words, just silence. I could feel the weight of his devastation, but I had no idea what he wanted from me. Maybe he was hoping I'd feel guilty, but I didn't. I didn't feel anything for him anymore. That's when it hit me. I had changed. The woman I had been, the wife who'd stayed home, the dutiful spouse, was gone. Ethan had unlocked something in me I didn't even know was there, and I wasn't about to slip back into that old role. I was someone else now, someone with power, someone who was wanted, not just tolerated. Mark, for all his coldness, wasn't about to let this betrayal slide. He didn't just see this as an affair. It was a blow to his pride, his ego, and his empire. Ethan hadn't just slept with me. He'd used us both, taking advantage of Mark's connections to further his own shady business. Mark's world wasn't just about the bottom line. It was about control, about maintaining the illusion of success and power. And when that illusion began to crack, it was like someone had swung a sledgehammer at it. But Mark wasn't the type of man to let something like this break him. No, he was going to make Ethan pay. And he was going to do it in the coldest, most calculated way possible. It didn't take long for Mark to begin plotting his revenge. He had the resources, the network, the power to destroy Ethan. Mark had always kept close ties with influential government agencies and regulators, and now those ties were going to work for him. He wasted no time pulling strings, making calls that would put immense pressure on Ethan. Mark started leaking information. Tax evasions, fraudulent transactions, illicit connections. All of it found its way into the right hands. Slowly but surely, Ethan's world began to unravel. At first, it was subtle, just a few audits, some questions raised. But soon enough, the cracks started to widen. State investigations were launched. No businessman, especially one as dirty as Ethan, could survive that kind of scrutiny. Mark made sure that every damaging document made it to the right people, that every accusation found its way into the media. This wasn't just revenge for the affair. It was about obliterating everything Ethan had built. Every time Mark saw a headline about Ethan's financial woes, his grin grew a little wider. Ethan wasn't going to get away unscathed. Not while Mark had a hand in it. But Mark wasn't done yet. What I had done with Ethan might have stung his pride, but his vengeance wasn't going to stop there. He wasn't just going to ruin Ethan. He was going to make me feel every bit of the betrayal. If I thought my affair had hurt him, he was going to make me pay by turning his revenge on someone else. And that someone, I soon realized, was my sister. I didn't see it coming. When Mark started spending more time with Hannah, I didn't think much of it. Hannah had always been quieter, more reserved, always content to stay in my shadow. I had always been the one getting attention, the successful wife with the high-powered life. But after everything with Ethan came out, something changed. I began to notice things, small, subtle changes in the way Hannah acted. She was quieter when I was around. Her phone was always glued to her hand, and sometimes she'd disappear for hours. At first, I thought she was just processing everything, maybe feeling bad for me. I never imagined she'd get caught up in this mess. She had always stayed out of my drama, but the more I watched her, the clearer it became. Something was happening. Something between her and Mark. I never imagined Mark would go after Hannah. She'd always been in the background, never someone he'd shown much interest in. But now she was the perfect pawn in his game. And Hannah was playing right into it. Hannah, who had always been emotionally distant, now seemed to crave something more. Attention, validation, the kind of things Mark was offering her now that he was done with me. I guess it was only a matter of time before she fell for it. I didn't fully grasp how deep things had gone until one night, when I came home early. I'd been out with friends, trying to escape everything for a little while. But when I opened the door, I heard them. Their laughter, the low murmur of their voices. It wasn't just a casual conversation. There was something about the way they spoke to each other that sent an icy chill down my spine. It was too intimate, too familiar. I froze in the doorway, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to process what I was hearing. When they saw me, everything stopped. The room went silent. Hannah's face turned bright red. And Mark? He just looked at me, a look that spoke volumes. I couldn't tell if he was ashamed, or if he even cared that I had caught them. But his eyes told me everything. He was getting his revenge, and he was doing it right under my nose. I didn't say anything at first. Couldn't. I just stood there, feeling like the walls were closing in. Hannah tried to explain herself, but I wasn't listening. All I could hear was the deafening silence in my head, the crushing realization that the woman I had trusted, the woman who was supposed to be my sister, had done the same thing to me that I had done to Mark. She had betrayed me. And what made it worse? She had done it with him, with my husband. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something, to make them feel the way I was feeling, to make them understand the pain that was ripping through me. But I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was watch as they hid behind their lies, knowing that this was just another move in the game Mark had started. From that point on, everything between us shifted. The dynamic between us changed in a way that couldn't be undone. Mark and Hannah were no longer just background noise in my life. They had become central figures in a game I never agreed to play. I had convinced myself I had the upper hand with Ethan, that everything was going according to plan. But in the end, it was Mark who ended up with the last word. He had manipulated me effortlessly, and now, he had flipped the script on me in the most humiliating way possible. As Olivia's world began to crumble, the full weight of her mistakes started to sink in. Her affair with Ethan hadn't just torn her marriage apart. It had set off a domino effect that she couldn't control. For so long, she had believed she was in the driver's seat, convinced that she could juggle her two lives without anyone catching on. But now, the damage was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the loss of Mark that stung. It was the entire collapse of everything she had worked so hard to build. Her affair had destroyed her family, her reputation, and now even her escape with Ethan was crumbling before her eyes. It was the way Mark started to behave that really hit her hard. He wasn't angry, not in the way she thought he'd be. There were no shouting matches or violent confrontations. He was chillingly calm. In fact, he was colder than ever before. But there was something about his calmness that terrified her. The more she apologized, the more he looked at her like she was a nuisance, something to toss aside. Every time they spoke, she could feel him gaining ground on her. He was using everything he knew about her affair with Ethan against her, and it was working. Then came that phone call from Ethan. She had been waiting for him to reach out, desperate for some sign that they could still make it work, that everything wasn't over. But instead of the reassurance she craved, she was met with a man completely shattered. Ethan, the man who had promised her excitement and power, was now on the verge of losing everything. His voice, when it came through the phone, was strained and broken. He wasn't angry with her. He was furious with himself, with everything around him that was closing in. The government probes, the audits, the media buzz. It was all happening, and Ethan had no way of stopping it. "Olivia, you have to let this go. It's too late," Ethan had said, his voice cracking with panic. "The business is sinking, and I don't know how to fix it." She tried to calm him down, tried to talk him off the ledge, but it was clear, Ethan was done. It was all too much for him to handle. The walls were closing in, and with that, her dreams of a future with him evaporated. She had built a fantasy around him, around what he could offer her. And now, just like everything else in her life, it was falling apart. Her lover was spiraling, and she was left with nothing but the shattered remnants of what could have been. Desperation took over. She called him again, texted him, nothing. He had shut her out completely. Ethan was too proud to admit just how badly he had failed. As much as Olivia wanted to believe in the power he had once promised, it was clear now that he wasn't going to be the one to save her. He was too consumed with his own pride and self-doubt to reach out. And so, Olivia found herself alone. No husband, no lover, no one. She was stranded on an island of her own making, and the tide was rising fast. The next showdown wasn't with Ethan, though it was with Hannah. The signs had been there for weeks. Something was off with her sister. At first, Olivia chalked it up to her own paranoia, but as the days passed, the pieces began to fall into place. Hannah had changed. She was more confident, more assertive, and always seemed to appear when Mark was around. Olivia's suspicion grew, and eventually, she couldn't ignore it any longer. So one evening, she confronted Hannah. The confrontation was ugly. It wasn't just that Hannah had betrayed her. It was that Hannah had been playing her own game all along. When Olivia confronted her about the affair, Hannah didn't even try to hide the smirk on her face. In fact, she seemed almost pleased with herself. "You think you're the only one who can get what she wants?" Hannah taunted. "You've always had it all, Em. The perfect life, the perfect husband. I wanted that too. I wanted to see what it felt like. And now I have it." The words cut Olivia deeply. Her sister, the one person she had always trusted, had been scheming against her for months. Hannah had always lived in her shadow, but now, she'd found a way to tear it all down. This wasn't just about a husband or an affair. It was about Hannah proving something to herself. It was about taking everything Olivia had worked for. "You think I did this for you?" Olivia's voice trembled with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You've always been jealous, haven't you?" Hannah didn't deny it. "You always had it all, Olivia. The perfect life, the perfect marriage, and I was just here, watching. I wanted a piece of what you had. And now I've got it." Each of Hannah's words was like poison, stabbing deeper than the last. Olivia felt the ground beneath her shake. Not only had Mark betrayed her, but her own sister had turned on her, too. The anger, the hurt, it all flooded in, leaving her raw and vulnerable. The fight didn't last long. Olivia couldn't bear to hear any more. She stormed out, but the damage was done. Everything she'd taken for granted, her marriage, her family, was slipping away. Meanwhile, Mark was getting exactly what he wanted. His revenge was unfolding right before his eyes. Ethan's empire was crumbling. The media was all over it, and the government investigations had unearthed enough dirt to bury Ethan for good. As the details of Ethan's shady dealings were exposed, his reputation was destroyed. The once powerful man was now a joke, scrambling to salvage whatever he could. Mark, for his part, couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction. He had won. He had beaten Ethan, and he had beaten Olivia. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash. He couldn't look away, but there was nothing left to save. Meanwhile, Mark and Hannah's life together moved forward without hesitation. The affair was no longer some whispered secret. Everyone knew, and Olivia was forced to watch as they lived the life she had once dreamed of, flaunting their new relationship in front of her. What was worse, though, was that she couldn't stop it. She couldn't stop Mark from moving on, couldn't stop Hannah from playing the role of the woman who had won it all. As for Olivia, she was left in the dust, alone, humiliated, and completely shattered. Mark had taken everything from her, and now he was walking away with Hannah. His revenge had been carefully planned and executed, and it had been nothing short of a triumph. For Mark, this was more than an affair. It was a declaration of control, a way to show the world who held the power. And Olivia? She was the one who had lost everything. As the dust settled and her world continued to fall apart, Mark wasted no time in making his final, ruthless move. Everything had already been exposed. The affair, the betrayal, the shift in power, and now it was time for him to seize the one last thing that still held any meaning: their marriage. With a cold, calculated calmness, he delivered his ultimatum, his words slicing through the silence like a knife. "Sign the divorce papers, Olivia," he said, his voice devoid of warmth, "or I'll make your life a living hell." Olivia had already been stripped of everything. Her lover was gone. Her sister had sided with Mark, and the very foundation of her life had been destroyed. She had no leverage, no allies, no one to turn to. Mark now held all the cards. He controlled her social standing, her financial future, and any chance she had of finding peace. Olivia knew she couldn't win this fight. She had lost a long time ago. Now it was just about how much more she could lose. Once the divorce papers were filed, the legal battle began. It didn't take long before Olivia's life crumbled completely. The house, the home she had once poured her soul into, was put on the market. The press had a field day, turning every aspect of her private life into tabloid fodder. And in every headline, Olivia was painted as the villain. Meanwhile, Mark, with his business acumen and ruthless instincts, made sure he came out on top, taking the lion's share of their assets. His strategy was flawless, while Olivia was left picking up the wreckage of what had once been her glamorous existence. The divorce itself was swift and brutal. Mark walked away with the family business, the investments, and most of their shared wealth. Olivia, on the other hand, was left drowning in debts and a reputation that was beyond repair. The judge ruled in Mark's favor, and the settlement served as a harsh reminder of just how thoroughly he had turned the tables. Olivia was powerless. There was no way to undo the damage. What had once been her life, her success, her future, was now nothing but a distant, painful memory. But the emotional toll was far worse than the financial. Olivia found herself completely alone, consumed with regret. Ethan, her escape, was no longer in the picture. His empire had crumbled, and he had cut ties with her completely, unable to deal with the aftermath of their affair. Even Hannah, her own sister, was no comfort. Hannah was too deep into her relationship with Mark to offer any sympathy, and Olivia quickly realized the betrayal from her sister ran as deep as that from her husband. Felt as though everyone had abandoned her. Her world had shrunk to a lonely, desolate place where every door seemed to slam shut. With no one left to lean on, Olivia realized she had to rebuild her life from scratch. But how do you begin again when everything you had is gone? How do you recover from the devastation of losing everything you once held dear? Olivia didn't have the answers. All she knew was that it wouldn't be easy. She wasn't the woman who had it all anymore. She wasn't the woman with power, influence, or respect. Now, she was just another woman trying to pick up the shattered pieces of a life she had destroyed herself. Mark, on the other hand, was thriving. The divorce was behind him, and his empire was expanding. His business deals grew more profitable, and his reputation in both the business world and politics soared. No longer hiding in the shadows, he flaunted his new life with Hannah, who was no longer just his lover. She was his equal, his partner in every sense. Together, they became a power couple, basking in the rewards of his calculated ruthlessness. Mark even threw a lavish celebration to mark the beginning of his new life. The event was grand, over the top even. It was packed with business moguls, political figures, and admirers, all of whom marveled at his drive and cunning. Not once was Olivia mentioned, no acknowledgement of the wreckage he had left in his wake. For Mark, this was his victory lap, a moment to raise a glass to the future he had crafted, one in which he stood at the top, completely unchallenged. For Olivia, the world felt like a bleak, uninhabitable place. As she observed from the sidelines, her heart weighed down with regret. She realized there was no going back to what she had lost. She wasn't just defeated by her husband. She was defeated by her own choices. In her quest for something, what exactly? Power? Control? A brief taste of freedom? She had thrown everything away. And now, in the aftermath, she was left with nothing. As for Mark, Mark had already moved on. He was living his new life, in his new world, surrounded by people who admired him, who respected him. The weight of his success bore down on Olivia, and all she could do was watch as he forged ahead, leaving her behind, like dust blown away by the wind. Her future was uncertain. All Olivia could do now was attempt to rebuild, but it was painfully clear. The woman she had been was gone. The wreckage of her decisions left no easy escape, no simple way out. Mark's new venture launched with the kind of precision only a man who knew exactly what he was doing could manage. He wasn't merely starting a business. He was cementing his place at the top. His new company quickly became a resounding success, and before long, his name was appearing in headlines once again. The industry took notice. His competitors, who had once written him off, were now scrambling to catch up. With the help of a brilliant new partner, just as ambitious and driven as Mark, they built an empire that rivaled some of the country's largest corporations. It was a masterstroke, a testament to Mark's business acumen. He had taken charge of his life in ways that most people could never fathom, bending the world around him to his will. And the rewards were not just financial, they were power, respect, and a sense of untouchability. He had become a figure to be both feared and admired. Meanwhile, Olivia's life couldn't have been more different. While Mark expanded, thrived, and secured his success, she struggled to pick up the pieces. The luxurious life she had once taken for granted was gone, replaced by the harsh grind of daily work and financial strain. She had lost everything: her reputation, her wealth, her relationships, and now, she was simply fighting to survive. Olivia had to start over in a completely different field, one that kept her far from the public eye. It was humbling, and every day felt like a battle. But despite the devastation she faced, Olivia refused to give in. She knew she couldn't reclaim the life she had once had. But that wasn't going to be the end of her story. The woman she had been was gone, yes, but the woman who remained was determined to rise again. It would take time, but Olivia slowly began to rebuild her life. She made new connections, found her independence, and started to find moments of peace. Still, deep down, she understood that she would never be the same. Mark had won, but in doing so, he had forever altered her. It wasn't just her circumstances that had changed. It was who she had become. The woman she was before the affair, before the revenge, before everything had been torn apart, was gone. And though she might never regain what she had lost, she would no longer be a victim. The price she'd paid for her mistakes had been steep, but Olivia was finding her way forward, one step at a time. As for Mark, he was living in a constant state of celebration. Every new success, every milestone, reminded him of just how far he had come. He had everything he ever wanted: power, wealth, respect, and the satisfaction of knowing that those who had once crossed him were thoroughly crushed. He had taken down Ethan, destroyed Olivia, and built a life that surpassed even his wildest dreams. But as the years went on, Mark began to feel something missing. For all his triumphs, something wasn't quite right. The victory had come at a steep price, one he hadn't fully understood until now. The affair, the revenge, the broken relationships, he had made those choices deliberately, and in the end, he had emerged victorious. But now, standing atop the mountain of his success, there was a part of him that wondered whether it had been worth it. The damage he had done to others and to himself was undeniable. Olivia, Ethan, Hannah, he had used them all, and in doing so had lost more than just his marriage. He had lost something intangible, something deeper, and it lingered in the quiet moments when he reflected. Mark wasn't sure he would ever have an answer to that question. But for now he stood tall, unchallenged, secure in his position. His empire was his alone, and he had no intention of letting anyone take it from him. Whether the cost had been worth it, that was a question only time would answer. But for now, Mark celebrated, knowing that, In the end, he had gotten everything he had ever wanted.